Hi guys, it's Subhasha here. So today we're going to be looking at the UK political system. So while we go through the slides, it's going to be a few slides where I don't really explain much or read through them for you. They're pretty self-explanatory and there's enough information on the slides for you to understand. But if you have any questions, please feel free to message me. And yeah, so let's get straight into it. So first thing, obviously we're talking about the UK political system. So our overview, we're going to be talking about the history of British politics, the government model, the branches of government, the Privy Council, British Parliament, political parties, elections and voting, and we're going to be looking at a case study. So let's quickly look at the history of British politics, right? So the British government has been breaking down the monarch's form of power for the past 800 years, and this has resulted in conflicts on governmental, social, and religious levels. Now, the real authority of the British governmental and political system rests with the Prime Minister. Previously, it was predominantly controlled by the monarch. Succession to the throne is hereditary, but only for Protestants in direct line of descent. Continuity of the English monarchy was only interrupted by the Cromwell Republic of 1649 to 1659. So this is an example of when the monarchy was interrupted. So it shows that the monarchy is not something that can't be interrupted, right? So I think that's something that's important for debate. So now let's look at the government model. So it's usually described as a constitutional monarchy, which is your royal family, and their role is largely symbolic and they have limited powers in terms of governance. Then you have your parliamentary democracy. So you have your supreme legislative body, and it's made up of two houses, namely the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So in terms of your House of Commons, it's composed of members of Parliament elected by the public in general elections, and the party with the majority of seats forms the government. The government can be dismissed at any time by a vote of no confidence. Then your House of Lords is your upper house, includes appointed members, hereditary peers, bishops of the Church of England, and they review and suggest amendments to legislation passed by the House of Commons. So the monarch has limited role to play on some executive and legislative levels. Parliament possesses the essential legislative power, and they follow the Queen in Parliament rule, which is all stated governmental businesses are carried out in the name of the monarch. So the monarch's duties include opening and closing of sessions of Parliament, giving royal assent to legislation, which is a formality required for a law to become for a bill to become a law, and performing various ceremonial and diplomatic functions. In terms of ceremonies, like your knighthood and those kinds of things. So the monarch's real political power is exercised by elected representatives and the government, right? So now let's look at our next slide, which is the constitutional theory. So British people hold political sovereignty to choose their government. Parliament possesses legal sovereignty to make laws. The monarch is formally the head of the executive, legislature, and judiciary, right? Now the branches of government. So in terms of our branches of government, it's made up of three branches, which is the legislature, executive, and the judiciary. So the legislature is made up of your House of Commons and your House of Lords, and the monarch controls it formally. And this is your supreme lawmaking body. Then the executive, this is the sitting government and its cabinet, and government ministries, departments headed by ministers, secretaries of state, and the monarch, which is also formally again. Then you have your judiciary. This is judges of higher courts and the monarch formally, right? Now let's look at our next slide. Okay, so the British monarchy. So the monarch has a number of roles and serves formally as the head of state, executive, judiciary, and legislature. They are also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and they're the supreme governor of the Church of England, and these obviously people swear allegiance to the crown. So the monarch cannot make laws, impose taxes, or spend public money, but they do, however, fulfill international duties as the head of state and grant honors. So all ministers and officials of the central government are the monarch's servants, and judges, military officers, peers, and bishops of Church of England swear allegiance to the crown. So the executive and legislative duties performed by the monarch include summoning, opening, and dissolving of parliaments, giving royal assent to bills, granting honors, holding audiences with prime ministers, giving pardons to some convicted criminals, and fulfilling international duties as the head of state, right? Now let's look at our next slide, which is looking at the Privy Council. So the Privy Council used to be a small group of royal advisors at court. Today, the main role is to advise the monarch. So life membership to the Privy Council is granted by the monarch, and currently there are 380 Privy Council members. So when is this full council summoned? So firstly, on the death of a monarch, when there is a serious constitutional issue, or occasionally when a Commonwealth head of state conference is being held in London. So they're not always convened. Then we're looking at the British Parliament, right? So the maximum duration that a party could serve in the British Parliament or a specific political party can serve is 5 years. And then the system that they use is the first past the post system. Then The maximum duration has sometimes been prolonged by special parliamentary legislation on occasions of national emergencies, such as the two world wars. So they do have parliamentary sovereignty, and this means that the legislative body has absolute sovereignty. So they are supreme to all other government institutions. So judges only interpret the law and not make the law. Then we're looking at the House of Lords and the House of Commons separately. So your House of Lords is made up of the Lords temporal and the Lords spiritual, right? And they attempts to reform the House of Lords were made several times during the 20th century. The Parliament Act of 1911 removed the power of the veto bill from the House of Lords. And now the House of Lords can delay a bill only up to 1 year. So now they cannot veto a bill because that was removed, but now they can only delay a bill up to 1 year. Then the House of Commons, the seats are given to England, who have the most seats, and then you also have seats given to Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And these countries form part of the devolution, and we'll talk about that later in the slide. In the House of Commons, of the seats given, 10% are women. And Britain is divided for electoral purposes into constituencies or geographical areas with approximately 60,000 voters per area. And they return one member of parliament to the House of Commons. So each constituency will return one member of parliament to the House of Commons, right? So cabinet is the formal body made up of the most senior government ministers chosen by the Prime Minister. So the UK voting system is called the first past the post, but we'll go on to later in the slide of in the PowerPoint of what the different types of voting systems are and how they use it, right? So now let's go into our next slide where we're talking about the British Parliament again. So the Reform Bill in 1832 clarified two basic principles of cabinet. Firstly, the cabinet should be composed of members drawn from the party or political faction that holds the majority in the House of Commons. And secondly, cabinet members are collectively responsible to the Commons for their conduct of government. So a loss of a vote of confidence or defeat of a major legislative bill in the Commons can mean a cabinet falls from power, and only people serving more than 12 months in jail cannot vote, right? So in terms of who can and who cannot vote in the UK system, it's only people who are serving more than 12 months in jail that cannot vote. Now we're looking at the different types of political parties that we have, right? So firstly, you have your Labour Party and you have your Conservative Party. So these are the two main parties, and you have other smaller political parties that exist. So in terms of your Labour Party, traditionally they gather support from trade unions, working class and middle class, whereas your Conservative Party support comes mainly from business interests and the middle and upper class. Your smaller political parties, they have some representation in the House of Commons, but it's not a lot. And these parties include your Liberal and Social Democrats and your Communist Party, right? Then in terms of the court system, so we're going from ascending to descending order. So it's like the one that's right at the top to the one that's at the bottom level. So firstly, you have your Supreme Court and Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. Then you have your Court of Appeal, your Civil Division, which is like your Civil Law and Family Justice, and your Criminal Division. Then you have your High Court, which is made up of the Companies Court, which has commercial fraud, business disputes, and insolvency. Then you have your Divisional Court, which deals with equity, trust, tax partnerships, and bankruptcy and land. Then you have your Patent Court, which deals with intellectual property, copyright, patent, and trademarks. Then next you have your Crown Court and County Court, and lastly you have your Magistrates Court and Tribunal Services. So I think what's particularly important here is number 3, which is your High Courts, to show you the different types of courts that you get and the different things that each specific court deals with, and this allows for judges in those specific courts to be specialized in what they're dealing with, right? So now we're going to look at the pros and cons of the UK political system and how we can actually use them in debates, right? So in terms of the pros, the first thing we're looking at is sustainability and continuity, right? So what does that look like? So the monarchy provides stable and continuous presence, and the system has endured this for centuries, and it contributes to a sense of tradition and historical continuity. So when we remove this, now people feel as if the entire world is collapsing because the sense of continuity and tradition and historical continuity has been removed, right? Then next we have the rule of law. So what is the rule of law? So the system places a strong emphasis on the rule of law, ensuring that laws apply equally to all citizens and that the judiciary is independent, right? So that's what they pride themselves on, the fact that the judiciary needs to remain independent and that the law treats everyone equally. Then another pro is this idea of accountability, right? So the parliamentary democracy allows for citizens to hold the government accountable through regular elections and parliamentary debates. So if the government loses a vote of no confidence or loses the confidence of the House of Commons, it can be replaced through democratic means, right? So if the government has to step down, they can still be replaced via democratic means. Then you have checks and balances, right? So the separation of powers between the executive, which is your government, and the legislative, which is parliament, and judicial branches helps prevent the concentration of power and promote accountability. So because these three branches are separated completely, there's no concentration of power on specifically the government or the parliament. So it allows for them to hold one another accountable and serve as checks and balances for one another. Next, we're looking at devolutions. The devolved legislatures these exist in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and they provide a degree of regional autonomy for these three countries, allowing the regions to address specific issues while still remaining part of the UK. So all of these countries form the UK, but they can make their own laws and have specific policies that are tailored specifically to their countries because they're better able to understand the needs of their countries and their people, right? Then you're looking at the cabinet system. So the cabinet system allows for efficient decision-making and policy implementations, as well as collective responsibility among ministers. Then you have gradual change. So what does that look like? So it's the lack of a single written constitution. This allows for flexibility to exist and adaptability over time as changes can be made through legislation and evolving norms. So what does this mean? We're going to talk about the fact that the UK has an uncodified constitution, right? So it means that the constitution is something that's not set in stone or something that's not written out. So this means that as time changes and as norms evolve and time progresses, they can make changes to their constitution because of how flexible it is, because it's not something that's set in stone like South Africa or the US has, right? Then we're looking at the independent judiciary. So the judiciary is independent of the executive and legislative branches, ensuring impartiality in decision making. Then we're looking at precedent. So the system relies on the principles of state decisions, where decisions in the higher court set legal precedents that lower courts must follow, right? And this helps with consistency and predictability of legal outcomes. So it's something that's very important. So like the higher court set a precedent what the lower court needs to follow, and they set standard of how laws need to be implemented or applied to people, right? Then we have specializations. So like we said earlier, there are specialized courts for specific areas, such as family, criminal, commercial, which allows for judges to develop expertise in their respective fields. So like if you look at your patent court or the court that deals specifically with like insolvency and business issues, right? And lastly, we're looking at access to justice, right? So there are mechanisms in place to ensure that individuals who cannot afford legal representation can still access the court system, such as legal aid. And that's something that's very important because in cases where people can't afford to go through the whole legal process, it's important that they have access to legal aid to be able to do so, right? Now let's look at some of the cons, right? So what is the cons? So firstly, we're looking at lack of proportional representation. So the first past the post electoral system is used for the general election and can lead to disproportionate representation and underrepresentation of smaller parties, right? And it may not accurately reflect the diversity of political opinions within the population. So remember we said that they're split in constituencies, and each constituency votes for a specific person. The person with the most votes makes it to the House of Commons. But in this case, it's not very representative of all the different political opinions within that constituency, and that's a problem in and of itself. Then you have the concentration of power, right? So the Prime Minister, as the head of government, wields considerable power, potentially leading to an imbalance between the executive and legislative branches, because at the end of the day, all of the decisions end up coming back down to the Prime Minister, and they generally hold the most power, right? Then we're looking at the hereditary elements, right? So the fact that you have the presence of hereditary peers in the House of Lords, and the monarchy in and of itself can be seen as undemocratic because people inherit the throne and they don't earn the throne. As positions of influence are inherited rather than earned, right? So that's something that's important to consider. Then a lack of an uncodified constitution. A lack of a codified constitution. So they have an uncodified constitution, it should be lack of a codified constitution. So it's the absence of a single written codified constitution can lead to ambiguity and uncertainty about certain constitutional matters, which may require reliance on unwritten conventions and historical procedures. So they don't have something that they can refer back to in situations where they're unsure about the decision-making process, and that's the problem because we need to refer back to historical problems or precedents and use other methods of reference. Then it could also be a weak upper house. So the appointed nature of the House of Lords raises concerns about its legitimacy, given that everyone within the House of Lords have inherited their position there. It's not something that they earn. And its limited powers can lead to less effective scrutiny of legislation. Then we're looking at political polarization. So the adversarial nature of the House of Commons debates can sometimes contribute to political polarization and gridlock. And this makes it very challenging to find a common ground on key issues, right? So the fact that the House of Commons consists of individuals from every constituency, as well as people from Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland can be a problem, and when they're making important decisions, it can lead to a gridlock because all these people can't reach an agreement. Then you have centralization and devolution. So while the devolution provides regional autonomy, it can also lead to tensions between central and regional governments, and especially when it comes to distributing resources and responsibilities. So because these countries have their own regional governments, it becomes a problem with them now all together and are trying to advocate for the best interest of the UK, because each individual country is going to prioritize their specific needs. And lastly, we're going to look at the lack of direct democracy. So the British political system relies heavily on representative democracy, which may limit opportunities for direct citizen participation in decision making. Right? So that's a problem in and of itself. Right? Now let's go through our next slide. Okay, so we're looking at two types of parties, which is our Conservative and Labour Party. So your Conservative Party, okay, prime example, person who is part of the Conservative Party is Winston Churchill. These are your right-wing, this is your right-wing party, and they believe in law and order and defense of private property, natural inequality, and natural hierarchy, traditionalism, and patriotism. Just generally like what your right-wing people believe. Then you have your Labour Party, this is your left-wing party, and you have a pre-Blair and post-Blair values. So pre-Blair values include redistribution of wealth, the role of the state in the economy, strong trade unions, social liberalism, etc. Your post-Blair values include free market capitalism, weaker trade union, but still having legal safeguards for workers and constitutional reforms, right? Then the next thing we're looking at is elections and voting. So in terms of elections and voting, we have 5 different types of things that can happen, right? So the general elections are held every 5 years, and these general elections are used to elect members of the House of Commons from constituencies all around the country, right? And after election, the leader of the party with the most MPs becomes prime minister and forms the government, and this is the first past the post system. Then you have your devolved assembly and parliament elections, and this is where you have your other states like Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and their elections are usually held every 5 years as well. And they choose members of the devolved bodies. So for Scotland and Wales, they use the additional member system, and Northern Ireland uses a single transferable vote system. Then you have your local elections, and this is held every 4 years, right? So in terms of your local elections being held every 4 years, this is for election of your councillors, police and crime commissioners, mayor, who is sometimes not always elected. So your England and Wales use the FPTP system, whereas Northern Ireland and Scotland use a single transferable vote system. So what's important to note here is that in each different type of election, there's not one standard system of voting. So the countries like, so for example, in general elections, England uses the FPTP system, and in like if you're looking at the second one, where Wales uses the additional member system, but in local elections they use the FPTP system. So it's not something that's constant. Then you have by-elections, and by-elections take place when there is a need to fill vacancies which arise when elected representatives step down and disqualified or pass away while in office. Lastly, we're looking at referendums. Referendums are usually held to measure public opinion on a single issue, and they ask people to choose between 2 options, so such as in the instance of Brexit, where they had a referendum and they asked people to choose whether they want to remain in the European Union or leave the European Union. And every vote counts towards the overall result rather than being counted by the constituency. So let's quickly look at some strengths and weaknesses of referendums, right? So a strength of a referendum is firstly, they can sometimes encourage a high level of voter participation. However, a weakness is that there should be a required turnout and size of majority for a referendum to result. Referendum results affect change, right? So where the result is close or turnout has not been as high, the outcome has to be questioned. So we're going to be looking at 2 case studies with the referendums, right? And in there you can see the one about the EU had a high turnout, but the results were very close. Whereas there was another case study that was done where it had a low turnout, but the results and the voting was not very close, right? So that's important to consider. Then they can offer a constitutional check on government as a strength. So major changes can only be made with support from the public. However, weakness, they can create significant divisions in public opinion, which may lead to political and economic instability. Another pro is that unlike elections, they can provide a direct answer to a specific question. However, the issue might be oversimplified in the process of creating a two-way question. So people might not have all of the information, or the oversimplification may not make people think about their decision as seriously as one should. A strength, again, sometimes they're useful when issues divide parties in and of themselves. However, a con is that the funding of campaigns can affect the turnout and the results of the referendum, as can the input of the media, and it has proved difficult to enforce legal campaign spending limits on when political parties are spending in terms of referendum to get people to vote for their beliefs, right? Lastly, let's look at another pro, which is the fact that they can stimulate public engagement with government policy and may encourage people to educate themselves about more specific issues and more deeply. However, another con is that in relation to this is that in the UK, there are no set rules about when a referendum needs to be held and whether the outcome is binding. So the action to be taken after the vote can be very uncertain. Okay, let's look at our next slide. Okay, so this is just talking about the different types of systems that we get. So you have your majoritarian, your proportional, and your manifesto, right? So your majoritarian is the electoral system designed to serve the majority, obviously majoritarian it's in the word. Then your electoral systems are designed to reflect the diversity of the population, and your manifesto is a declaration of intention published by political parties and in the lead up to an election. Okay, so in slide 17 and 18, so this is looking at the different types of voting system, and it explains what the voting system is about, which countries uses it, and the strength and limitations, right? So the main ones here for you guys to consider and to look at is the first past the post system, the single transferable vote, and the additional member system, because these are the ones that members of the UK use. So yeah, these ones you can just read over, just make sure you understand excuse me, the strengths and limitations of these voting systems. Then next we're looking at the devolution. So the devolution is made up of 4 countries, which is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the balance of power between these countries has often been a subject of fierce debate and has changed from time to time. A major change took place in 1997 and 1998 when referendums in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland led to Parliament to allow those countries to set up their own democratic institutions, right? So this is when it occurred when they separated. When they weren't all governed by one law, they were able to establish their own democratic institutions. The UK Parliament has reserved its power to make laws in areas considered essential to the Union, such as international relations, defence, and the economy, including taxes and benefits. So the UK Parliament only steps in when it's something that affects everybody equally and not something that affects one specific country, right? Decisions over other areas of government, including health, education, housing, and the environment, and transport, have increasingly been devolved or delegated to these bodies who are based nearer to the people their decisions affect, right? So devolution in the UK is often used as an example of the flexibility of the UK Constitution, which has been able to accommodate this change without it meaning the breaking up of the UK. Then we're looking at Parliament. So the main work of Parliament falls into 3 broad categories. So firstly, legislation where they make laws. Secondly, scrutiny, which is checking and challenging the work of government. And lastly, representation, which is representing the views of people across the country. So the work of Parliament is separate from the work of government. So government is responsible for the day-to-day administration of the country, but Parliament holds them accountable, holds them to account and makes the laws, right? It is important to distinguish between the work of Parliament, which is legislation, and the work of government, which is executive. So in the UK, these 2 branches of power are closely linked compared to their relationship with in the presidential system in the USA. So when you do the USA political system, you look at the difference between the UK and the USA political system, where in the USA, the presidential, which is the executive, elections are held independently of those to form the legislature. So these are just 10 lawmaking terms that I think is important for you guys to know. It's just like the type of people using debate to be able to understand what these terms mean. So English votes for English laws. So the House of Commons has a system to ensure that legislation which only affects certain areas only requires backing from the majority of MPs from these areas in order to pass. So the Speaker has the authority to decide whether a bill should go through this process known as the EPEL, which is English votes for English laws, based on these 2 conditions. Firstly, the legislation will only affect England or England and Wales, and it is about something that which a devolved body could also legislate about. Okay, so now in terms of these 10 lawmaking terms, these are also something that you can just read through and be able to understand what these different words mean. So it's just important to know what these words mean in terms of like, if you're in a debate and people use these words, you actually understand what they mean. So yeah, you can just go to slide 21 and 22. Then the case study that I'm speaking about in terms of the referendum. So you can see here, the EU referendum, the turnout was 72%, but look at how close the votes. 51% said leave and 48% said remain in the EU. So this is something that shows that referendums cannot always be as reliable and should still be backed up, and people need to have sufficient information, right? Because sometimes it's oversimplified, people don't make the correct decisions. Whereas if you compare to this, the next one, which is your alternative vote referendum, you can see that the turnout was so low, there's only 42%, but look at the difference, right? 32% voted for yes and 67% voted for no. So the results of the referendum won that the turnout was so low. So can you consider the result to be reliable if the turnout was so low? So yeah, this you can just read through the studies. I think it's important to know in terms of the EU case study, the main campaigning issues in terms of like people who voted to leave the EU and what they understood, people who believe that Britain was stronger in Europe and what they believe. So I think that's important there. Okay, in terms of the UK Constitution, so the Constitution contains the rules by which a country is organized, including the specific powers and duties of the government and the rights and responsibilities of all its people. The UK has an uncodified constitution, which means that its rules have never been written down together in a single legal document, and some have not been written down at all. Supporters of uncodified constitutions argue that if you try to reduce a nation's entire legal, political, and ethical and social issues into a single definitive list, you risk oversimplification. They would also argue that it is a risk of creating a set of sacred rules that cannot be challenged, which may prevent a nation from adapting as times change. Uncodified constitutions are flexible, but they are also more complex and nuanced. For this reason, decisions about whether something constitution in the UK may be referred to a judiciary are independent of the government and can challenge their decisions and actions. So this is just providing you with like some of the pros and cons of like having a written constitution and not having a written constitution. I think that's something that's important to use in debating. And then on the side, we just have a few definitions of what uncodified means: parliamentary sovereignty, legislative, and executive, right? Next, we're looking at campaigning, right? So campaigns seek to influence the activities of government and public policy. They can be started by individuals or groups of individuals known as pressure groups. So effective campaigns usually focus on one specific issue. Pressure groups generally fall into two categories. Firstly, those who campaign on one issue, which is known as casual groups, and those who campaign on a range of issues linked to a theme known as sectional groups. So pressure groups sometimes provide the government with information and assist with inquiries related to their area of interest. It can be difficult for individuals on their own to influence policy and political decisions. A group of like-minded people working together can have more impact and more success and be more successful in getting their concerns heard by the government and the general public. So pressure groups include registered charities, trade unions, women organizations, faith-based organizations, professional business associations, and community groups. So you have insider and outsider pressure groups, right? So your insider pressure groups are pressure groups which include or work closely alongside politicians, and they will often have strong party affiliations, whereas your outsider pressure groups are these groups who and their campaigning methods are often public driven. They will tend to use mainstream media more often than insider pressure groups. There, slide 26 and 27 are just cool things that I think you guys could use in terms of like being able to use examples of debates, so examples where raising awareness has worked, examples where using petitions has worked, examples where direct action has worked, where someone has done a popular protest and it's worked. Then here we're looking at political party, which is like Green Party. Then we're looking at lobbying, and last we're looking at NGO. So this is just like things that you can use as examples when you're arguing to show like these specific things actually help in debate where you talk about political systems and where you're trying to advocate for political systems, for example, lobby. So using an example of where lobbying has actually worked, right? So thank you guys. We've now reached the end of this presentation. I hope it was helpful. And if you have any questions, please do let me know.